let me give a little bit of context to exactly, what we do at RTBers and how it brings us to this. So we're essentially insurance brokers. I mean, I guess that's what it says on our door and our business cards, but we do a little bit more than that. We got involved with the metal service center industry about 25 years ago. And what we've seen, and probably what you see a lot of, is when you purchase your insurance, probably about 75% of your insurance goes into your auto, your fleet, as well as your workers' comp. You also have, your general liability and your property insurance. But at the end of the day, about 75% of it is your work comp and your fleet, which involves your employees. So what a lot of people do every year is they go out and bid their insurance and try to find the cheapest price out there. We've moved away from that whole model, and what we're about is actually in a culture shift, so you have the best safety employees out there. So when you have, whether you have your employees on the floor operating a shear or a slitter, that there's those safety, those historical safeties, and you can use that to leverage cheaper premium. So that's essentially how we got started in this whole risk management, metal service center industry, and training supervisors. So let me jump right into it. Let me see. Oh, jumped away from me. There we go. Can you guys see everything okay, Carly?
Just see you right now, Kelly.
Can you see the screen?
Can't see the slides yet.
Okay, let me see. Just good?
Yes, I see the slide deck, not the full view yet. Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Perfect, we go, okay. So what it comes down to is finding the right people for your organization comes down to three things. You have to hire the right people, then you have to train them, and then you have to coach them. And you can't do one without the other. You can't hire a great candidate, but then you neglect on the training and the ongoing coaching, because that, employee eventually falls through the cracks. And same thing, you can't really hire a bad apple and then expect to have the best training and coaching and create a model employee. So with that, we have, the hiring, training, and coaching component are the three most important things, and you can't have one without the other. So jumping right into hiring people. So I've been talking to a lot of HR managers, operations people, and I say, what's the best practices you guys do? So when you guys are going out first looking and say you have a position to fill, you have to go through and have the hiring supervisor, the direct supervisor, go through and review the responsibilities and the scope of the requirements. Do they really need to lift 50 pounds a day 50 times, or has it been outdated? These should be working models. So if you have somebody new to the organization that you really want to introduce, you need to make sure that your hiring manager looks directly at those and makes sure that your requirements, first and foremost, are still up to date to what needs to be done. And then the second thing to do is speaking with Bob over at metalcareers.com. He was telling me he's a headhunter. One of the top three questions that organizations need to ask themselves too when they go out to hire, how are basically we perceived in the marketplace? Because you could think you're a great organization, but if you have a reputation of having a kind of a poor safety culture, or people are just hiring to get in and out, it's good to be aware of that, because what you are as an organization, the market kind of dictates what type of candidates you have to come. So really ask yourself these three hard-hitting questions. Are you perceived as the employer of choice out there? Are we actually hiring better people than we did last time around? And are your people ultimately more productive and safer than your competitors down the street? Those are three big questions that you need to ask yourselves. Going forward from there is, what are you going to use to find the best people for your organization? A lot of people for on the floor, they use a lot of the temp to hires. So they can get them, they can observe them. If they do a good job, then they can be hired over time. You can use somebody like a recruiter like Bob over at metalcareers.com, where he can headhunt and vet the people for you. You can use word of mouth, or you can always use the websites and job posting boards like Monsters or LinkedIn. With each one has its, has its positive and negatives. If you use word of mouth, the problem is when people will actually, it's for all of them, is when people come in to do an interview, you know, they're basically bringing a PR version of themselves. It's like kind of going on a first date. You say exactly what the other person wants to hear. Yes, I'll show up on time. Yes, I work hard. I'll stay late. I won't ask questions. I'm your best friend and I'm your best employee that you've ever seen before. I don't like to take vacations. You know, what's my biggest pitfalls? Well, that I show up early and I work too hard. You know, those are the kind of things that people typically say. You know, they bring the PR version of themselves. But what you really need to do is drill down to see, you know, A, is this person selling you a false bill of goods, meaning are they actually who they say they are? And, you know, when you use attempt to hire, it's great because you can actually observe them and vet them going on with their supervisor and ask their employees. A recruiter like Bob over at Metal Careers can actually vet them for you, and he's actually done all the process. Sometimes when you use the word of mouth, when, you know, you bring in somebody's cousin, which happens a lot, or if you use somebody like Craigslist or Monster, it's somebody just sending out, you know, copious amounts of applications hoping to get hired. So I guess it really all depends too on what you're hiring. You know, if you're hiring somebody on the floor, you probably use attempt to hire. If you're hiring somebody to work in HR, sales, a C-suite, you might be using something like a website or a recruiter. But the two essentially pitfalls that you can face are, you know, are they selling you a false bill of goods? Are they really who they say they are? And is there any potential pre-existing injuries? Because the last thing you want to do is hire somebody and then a week later they strain their back and all of a sudden they're out on workers' comp disability. So a way to get through that is essentially have them demonstrate their knowledge and pass a pre-employment physical. You can have a pre-employment physical or fit for duty test done at your industrial clinic, which can be Concerto or US HealthWorks or whomever you use when somebody has a first responder for an injury. What I would suggest though, if you're using a pre-employment fit for duty test for a specific job, is actually separate that from your current industrial clinic where people go if they get injured on the job place. And the reason I do is it kind of separates the two. Because, you know, industrial clinics, they get paid by people getting hurt and coming back to get medications, doing PT, things like that. So it just kind of, it doesn't dilute it as much. So you'll have the fit for duty test done at, you know, industrial clinic A, and then your first responder clinic will be industrial clinic B. So that's what I would recommend, to have them demonstrate their knowledge and then pass that, you know, fit for duty test. You know, if the job needs to lift 50 pounds 50 times a day, well, they'll go through that and make sure they can actually do it. So once they get to work, they can't, you know, have that back injury or that strain or whatever it might do to essentially, you know, lead you into a workers' comp claim. Once you find the right person and they jump on board, is assign a supervisor or a mentor to work with that individual. That way you can assimilate them into the culture, because if Kelly goes on board and starts working at Steger Metals and street at, you know, Zebra Metals, and I've been doing things, you know, one way, hands, leave them in the stacks, you know, I can lift 100 pounds by myself and not get help, you know, I'm used to speeding around, not wearing my seatbelt on my forklift, and I just, you know, jump right into working with you guys. You know, the possible pitfalls is I have my own set of beliefs, and I may not know that you guys are a lot more safer, so I'll just fall back. So a supervisor and a mentor to that is pivotal. Also, what you do is performance of these individuals. A lot of people do 90-day audit on individuals, but I'm a fan of doing it about 30 to 45 days. The reason that is 90 days a lot of things go wrong. So you could get an injury. You know, they could hurt somebody else. They could sell you that false bill of goods and not really be that employee that you think they are. And you've been stuck with them for 90 days now and you realize they're not a good fit. Well, now you have to go back out to the marketplace and try to find another employee to fill that in. If you audit them about 30 to 45 days and you ask for the feedback from their employees, from their team members, the supervisor chimes in, and you guys can manage, you know, what exactly, if they have to operate the pendant for the crane, and audit their performances to see how good they are. And within 30 to 45 days, if you realize they are a good fit, well, you can bring them on board and continue the training. If they're not a good fit, well, or not higher than them. "30 to 45 days gone by, maybe your number 2 choice or number 3 choice or number 4 choice, so they bring on, as opposed to if you wait 90 to 120 days, those people are not. So the high supervisor go through to make sure the scope is still up to date. These are all working documents. 2 is, give them a fit for duty test and make sure they can demonstrate their knowledge. 3 is assign a supervisor or a mentor to make sure they can assimilate into your organization. And then, do an audit performance to see exactly who they are and exactly if, Kelly Parker is the role model employee that I sold myself during that interview. Can you still hear me out there, Carly?
Yes, sorry, Kelly. We were just having a couple audio issues, I think, with the video trying to catch up with the audio. But I can hear you clear.
Okay, yeah, okay. I just want to make sure we're still good. Okay.
Yep. I think it's just some of the moving around a little bit, but we're good.
Okay. Perfect. All right, let me jump right back into it. Okay, so if there's any hiring, feel free to ask, touch on a couple more, or we can move right down on into what I think is the meat of everything, is the actual training and the coaching. Because once you hire an employee, you want to make sure you train and coach them into your model employee. But it's not as basic and as easy as it seems. A lot of people ask, how often do you do coaching? They say, I do it when I have to, or I do it monthly, or I'll do it quarterly. But what's really important is to do it, what we'll stress here is with our 5 tools, is to kind of do an ongoing coaching and training session throughout the history of this employee. So jumping right into it, who's going to be leading these individuals? It's essentially a supervisor. And supervisors, as we've seen over the years, move up through the ranks. Say Gabriella has been working at your organization for a long time. She shows up on time. She does her job. Great. She's a great team player. And on that Friday, you go up to Gabriella and say, Gabriella, you've done a great job. Come Monday, you're going to be a supervisor. Gabriella's really excited because she goes home, tells her family it's probably a bump in pay, $1 or $2 an hour, and she's really excited. But when she gets to work on Monday and now she's coaching and directing the people that she worked alongside, sometimes they're not equipped to have the tools to necessarily match their new role as a supervisor. And essentially a supervisor, what they do is they're a manager of people. So in your organization, talking about on the floor, there's essentially 2 types of people. There's the order processor, which takes the raw material, which could be blanks, and then puts them on to a slitter and pushes them through, or a shear, and then they get through the process and they're done. What a supervisor essentially does is they're a manager of people. They're the coach. They're the empathetic person that's going to be training, directing, and coaching and motivating these people to be a good order processor. So it's not just one of those things where Gabrielle is excited, comes in Monday, and she's just innately equipped to start doing all these coaching tools. And that's where we developed this supervisor workshop that we've actually gone through. And as Carly referenced, we've trained about 500 supervisors nationwide on what it means to be a supervisor. Because as basic as it might be, it's harder in practicality than it is, on paper. So what skill set does it take to be an effective supervisor? Well, you have to be people sensitive. You have to be empathetic. You have to be an effective communicator. You have to be a positive motivator, and you have to be a problem solver. Taking it a little bit further is what I say makes a good supervisor, or I apply this to anything in life in general, is always give 51% to the relationship. Doesn't matter who you are. If you're the owner, if you're the supervisor, if you're the employee, if we're talking about your relationship at home or with your friends, always give 51%. Because if most people are given 51%, then they always, I wouldn't say feel indebted, but they know that you have that sense of care. They know that Gabriella, really cares about Kelly while he's on the floor and doesn't want to see him get hurt, because she makes that extra effort to give the 51%. Always give more than you take away. And then another one is, people sensitive. We see a lot of, let me see how to phrase this. You walk by an employee's desk, or we've all encountered this situation, their desk or their work area, and you realize, there's something in the air that they feel a little bit down, distraught, or that there's something wrong with them. Most people would just keep their head down and say, okay, well, I don't want to have that awkward conversation with, Kelly. I'm just going to let it go. What an effective supervisor or coach or manager or owner does is takes the time, puts the hand on the shoulder and says, hey, Kelly, I realize something might be bothering you. Do you want to talk about it? Is there anything I can do to help? That's what I think sets everything apart as a supervisor. Because at the end of the day, that's what people really want to do. They're spending 8 hours a day plus your organization to work. Every organization is going to get paid relatively the same, maybe a quarter more, $1 more an hour. But at the end of the day, the 2 weeks vacation, the $13 versus $14 an hour, it doesn't make as much of a difference as it does when you have quality people who care about you, when you have supervisors that stop to make sure that you're feeling okay, when they know that your dog had to have surgery to check in to say, is little Ruffy doing better? Those are the things that really makes the difference to being an effective supervisor and coach, because they'll know that you ultimately care about them. So continuing on is to be an effective supervisor, you have to be, proactive versus reactive. Being an effective supervisor, what I think of is, here's the example is you hear dish, 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 and you have a shear at your location. What's that letting me know? Well, chances are they're cutting some thin strips out there. So as an effective supervisor, if I'm out on the floor, what I do when I hear that is I walk over to make sure that that guard's in place. Because if they're doing little small cuts, chances are somebody could be feeding their fingers through, and that could be an accident. And you don't want to be reactive in that situation when somebody loses a couple of digits. It's better to be, proactive. And when you start to realize things before they actually happen, that's when you're really making a big difference on your impact and safety. So leading on is, this is a big thing that we subscribe to, is, I could go down the percentages, but 9 out of 10 accidents happen because somebody elects to do something unsafe. It's not because they've had the lack of training. It's not because there's faulty equipment that fails on them. It's because somebody elects to do something safe. A prime example is somebody gave us a call and somebody was forklift. They were trying to put some tubes back on the racks, and so rather than do what they normally do and drop it down and push it in, is they thought they could do a little shortcut, and they tilted the arms down because it would just tumble off right onto the racks, about 10 feet high. Well, as you can imagine, it didn't work out so well. Luckily, I had a cage around the forklift, but it came tumbling down. And, that's just the 9 out of the 10 times that's why the accidents happen. If somebody elects to do a shortcut, somebody does something unsafe. And it's never because of the poor equipment. It's never because of lack of training. Not never, but 92% of the time, it's because of an unsafe act. So what are unsafe acts? Well, not paying attention. Like I said, taking shortcuts, using poor body mechanics if you're lifting 50 pounds this way or dropping it down and stooping this way. Not putting things in place they shouldn't be. So if you're leaving, boards and blocking outs on the floor and somebody trips and slips on them, or thinking, nothing I can do to make me get hurt. That's the person that doesn't put the guard back on the saw blade because it takes too long. They've never gotten cut before, so it's never going to happen again. Well, never say never, because chances are, so, not paying attention, taking shortcuts, poor body mechanics, putting things in place they shouldn't be, and thinking, nothing I can do can cause me to get hurt. And we've classified these into 2 categories. The at-risk behavior is the not paying attention, the taking the shortcuts, the complacency and the daydreaming. And then there's the high-risk decision-making, and that's when you're faced with an unusual circumstance. If you start to see some tubes, you're walking through the stacks, and it's stacked higher than the stanchion here, and they start to tumble over, well, that's a high-risk decision-making. What do? I got to run into the stacks to avoid them or run out of the stacks. And this happens quite a bit, which you guys have probably heard through the grapevine, and, that's one of the high-risk decision-making. Thinking, like I said, nothing cause me to get hurt. I've lifted this box 75 pounds all by myself a million times. I've never gotten hurt. I live with my back, not my legs. You know, we've always done it this way. Those are the types of high-risk decision making. So how do you want to, you know, get your employees to work safe? Well, there's the short-term impact, and that's do the job once. You know, hey, Brad, you know, when you lift up those and they're over 50 pounds, you know, go get help lift that box, and you guys can lift it together. Or, you know, giving incentives. You know, I actually had a discussion with a lot of supervisors about incentive programs, and some people are pro, and some people are, you know, are against. And they'll typically have it as a monthly, they'll have a quarterly, have a yearly program, and they probably reach the monthly 3 times maybe, a quarterly maybe once or twice, and they've never reached the year. You know, and that goes to say something. So you're giving out money all this time, or as far as it might be, and you've never really reached that goal. So is it really giving you a better result? You know, I'm just not a fan of incentive programs, but each organization is different. You know, whether you do poker, you know, a lot of people that told me is, you know, if you do it and you have a lottery, everybody gets to put in, you know, names because they've done some safe tax recently. They, you know, reported near misses, and Kelly Burke's name gets, well, the other people whose name was something don't get rewarded. So it just rewards one person as opposed to the whole organization for being, or the shift, whatever it might be. So that's the short-term impact. 2 is what I'm a big fan of, is the long-term impact. And that's, you know, basically changing employee behavior through the ongoing training, coaching, and the rewarding. You know, that's the pat on the back. That's to knowing what, you know, as a supervisor, if you 51 added, essentially how that would affect the group behavior. So what we would like to do through the training, the coaching, and the supervising is you start to shape a person's knowledge of, you know, you explain the why. Why do we do safe things? Well, A, we don't want to see anybody get hurt. B, if we have over 100 experienced mod, we don't get a lot of contracts. C, if there's claims or questionable claims, it hurts the organization because we have to pay more in workers' comp, and it takes away from the salary and business we could do to grow the company, buy capital equipment, things like that. So once you explain the why do you want employees to be safe? It starts to shape their knowledge, their attitude, their behavior, and it helps shape the whole total group. You know, and that's back to the experiences shape the beliefs to the actions, which leads to the results. But again, it's as basic as it might be, it's not as easy as it may seem, because you have to realize as a supervisor that whether you're training or coaching myself or somebody else in the organization, we're different, you know. And in the context I'm going to talk about right now, we label every person in an organization as a 1, 2, or a 3. A 1 employee is the highly motivated individual who does a good job. It's typically the person that gets motivated to be a supervisor over time. They take pride in their work. You know, they're successful and they don't complain about things. You know, they're positive and they're good influences on other people. As we say, they tend to be quiet and not part of the bitch group, which I'll get on as group number 3. So that's the 1s. And then you have the 2s. Most employees fall into this because, like everything else in life, it's a bell curve. So about 60% of your employees will be 2 employees. Those are people who are somewhat motivated. They generally just check. They won't do the extra effort, but they won't complain. They, you know, might have a family to support, and they just show up at work, they leave at 5 o'clock every day. They do their job, and they're done with it. And then we get to the 3 group. Well, these are the employees that are the disruptive group. They're not really motivated. You know, they typically have poor attendance. They'll show up on late. They'll always have an excuse. You know, they're on the fringe of every aspect of production, quality, and safety. They're typically a little bit loud and aggressive. If you try to do a coaching and say, you know, lift with your legs, they'll chime in and say, well, I've always lifted with my back and I've never gotten injured. You know, things like that. And so you have to be really aware of these group 3s because, like I said, everything's a bell curve. So if you have 60% in group 2, then you have 20% in group 1 and 20% in group 3. You know, this 20% in group 3 is, you know, I heard it explained the other day, is kind of like a cancer. If you let them go unattended, you know, a couple bad apples will ruin the barrel. They'll really do this because the 2s that are the most impressionable will look, and the 3s, since they're awfully loud and aggressive, will try to pull them down. They'll be the ones that disrupt your coaching sessions, your training session, and they'll look around and try to lock eyes with somebody that's a 2, and then they'll know it's kind of game on. And they can say, well, you know, yeah, I cut the bands and leave them all the stacks all the time, but, you know, I'm too busy being productive, and nobody's ever gotten hurt, right, guys? And they'll look to Kelly to kind of give that nod of, and then they know it's on, and they keep playing and playing and playing. So it's good to recognize who these 1s, 2s, and 3s in your organization are. Your 1s are your most important, your 2s are your most impressionable, and your 3 is what we'll call it as essentially the disruptive group. It's good for each organization to be able to go through and identify how many people, you know, if you can think real quick on your shift or on your floor in your organization, okay, who's the 1, 2, and 3? You know, Cynthia, is she a 1, 2, and 3? Is Erica 1, 2, and 3? Is Juan or Damien a 1, 2, and 3? And then you'll start to realize, okay, that makes more sense. So when I'm talking to them, I have to be more directing to the group 3 as opposed to the that I can call on to lead groups. So what do you do for your next supervisors? You use them to lead training and coaching. When you say, hey, can you demonstrate how to operate the slitter safely? You use the 1 to go through and show them how to load the coil on. You have them, you know, mentor the new employees along with the supervisor to really assimilate them in the group. Your 1s are your champions. You know, they're your all-stars. Those are the ones that you pat on the back, you let them know that they're rock stars, and you allow them to soar. Your 2s, focus a lot of, you know, your effort towards this group because there's, like I said, 60% of your organization will probably fall into it too. You guide them through positive work ethic. You reinforce it with 1s leading by example, you know, the desired behavior, and you keep them engaged in the process throughout. You don't want them to be beyond friends, or else they'll fall into the 3 category. So the 2s you really want to keep track of and make sure that the 1s pull them in to kind of assimilate that rather than be pulled down. Because the group 3 employees, those are a little bit more of your challenging ones. Like I said, those are the ones that will pull you down, and regardless of your best efforts, they just won't do it. You know, it's like I said, it's all about hiring, training, and coaching. And some people just can't be trained and coached. It's just in their DNA to be defined, and they just don't want to do it. They want to bring everything down. So when you start counseling your 3 employees, you have to be more direct with them rather than open-ended questions. So getting into that, let's jump right into the 2- and 3-minute coaching sessions. So how are we doing, Carly?
Sorry, let me unmute Kelly. We're doing okay. Audio's cutting out a bit, so I'm not sure if we maybe want to switch to mic only and kind of go that route. Just because, you know, we've got a lot of good content to cover here, so I want to make sure everyone's getting to hear all of it. Is that possible? Oh, perfect. Let's see.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's a little bit better. Let's see how that goes. So,
okay, sorry if the video was cutting out. Like I said, we're experimenting with some new stuff over here.
Yeah. I mean, you know, it's trying something new. I like it. Hey, question for you. What is the best way to do safety training? Is it, you know, through third party or online or videos, or what would you suggest?
I think it's up to each organization. I'm a big believer in, that's why we created this supervisor training course course is train the trainer, train somebody internally. We'll go out there and, since we do these coaching sessions, people say, well, Beers, why don't you guys just do this all the time for us? And because essentially, same with if you have a third-party vendor come in to do the trainings, is if you fire us, who's left internally in your organization to lead these trainings? Because if you have us as your insurance broker come through and lead all these safety training sessions, which we're more than happy to do, and we do a lot of the times, but we try to really have the trainer and have the supervisor take ownership, because like I said, at the end of the day, if we get fired, then there needs to be somebody internally to be your champion in your organization. Whether it's videos or on the floor, as you'll see, I'm a big believer in 2 to 3 minute coaching sessions. Like I said, I ask people all the time, how often do you do trainings? And a lot of people say, well, I do it, every month or quarterly or annually. And I understand for certain things like crane certification or forklift that you have to do every couple of years. But as far as coaching and training, that's just an ongoing thing that, as you'll see right now, that we recommend through these 5 tools: hazard identification, visual observation, self-inspection, and accident investigation. So what exactly does that mean? Well, a quick 2 to 3 minute coaching session is essentially just a quick timeout on the floor, where you're communicating with your group of employees, what you kind of see out there and what you want to see done better. It's best when you do, when you see, repetitive unsafe behavior. So people speeding around forklifts and not honking the horns around corners, or, putting their fingers, below the guards, or, not putting the blades back on the saws, or I'm sorry, the guards back on the saws. Those are the types of things that you want to use, 2 to 3 minute coaching sessions for. Use it for just after you complete your self-inspection review form. And this goes for anybody out there. If anybody doesn't have a self-inspection review form, feel free to Carly or send an email directly to myself, and I'll send you over a template as well. Like I said, I want to provide value. So if there's anything that you need extra help with here that you guys don't have in your organization, or you want me to look over, I'm more than happy to take a look at it. And then lastly, for employees that you want to show corrective, unsafe behavior. So, for positive motivation behind things. So how do you do a quick 2 to 3 minute coaching session? Well, essentially it's an impromptu, timeout. To use a football analogy, it's during a midseason game. Imagine, there's been a breakdown in the blocking. What happens typically? Do they wait until after the game and kind of review the plays to say, hey guys, next game let's do this better, or they take a real timeout right then and there and say, hey guys, we need to do this next play, get on it? Or in a real life example is, you see your son driving around town or your daughter and they're blowing through stop signs. Are you going to wait till Sunday when you see this on a Friday or a Thursday to kind of address it? Or as soon as they walk in the door, do you want to say, hey, little Landon, I saw you blow through a couple stop signs today. What's that all about? You need to do corrective action, on the spot. These are these quick 2 to 3 minute coaching sessions. And they shouldn't take any longer than 2 to 3 minutes. They're not going to take away from your productivity. It should be done right on the floor in small groups. And it's good if you wait for, right before the lunch break so they have time to kind of ponder it, or before the end of the day. So what essentially do you say? And so this is another one of those things where it sounds basic, but this is typically part of a 2-day workshop that we do, and this is where we spend the whole second day is the actual role playing. Because although supervisors, like I say, have moved up through the ranks by being quality, sometimes they're not the ones that are really good at being what they think of as public speakers. And that's why we use these tools and go through the workshop to let them know essentially what they're doing is, they're just giving them a quick 2 to 3 minute timeout where, an example would be is like, hey guys, I just don't want to see anybody get hurt. I saw, a lot of blocking on the ground, and I think that's a trip and fall hazard. And you guys know I care about you. I don't want to see anybody trip and fall to get hurt. I don't know who left it out there, but come on guys, let's make a good effort to make sure that we keep the walkways, because we don't want to see any slip, trips, and falls here. Okay, thanks. And that's essentially kind of how you go through it. And you'll be going through it, like I said, with your 1s, 2s, and 3s. So if you have a one within the organization, you say, hey, Sharon, can you actually do the proper lifting technique on, how to lift up these boxes? And, Sharon can demonstrate how to lift with her legs, her back straight to lift up and not get hurt. And then you can have a two kind of demonstrate. You say, thanks, guys. Like I said, I don't want to see anybody get hurt. The number one, claim in workers' comp is, strains and pulls, and I don't want to see anybody get hurt. So let's lift safely, kind of how Sharon demonstrated. And then, like I say, you end it with a thanks, and then everybody gets back to work. It doesn't take any longer than that. So kind of a review it. It's you as the sender. They give the purpose. I don't want to see anybody get hurt. What's the topic? I've seen a lot of cut bands in the stacks. I've seen a lot of coils that aren't chained down. The pressure will cause them to roll away. You guys kind of understand that. I don't want to see everybody get hurt. Confirming question. Yes, that's right. Okay, thanks everybody. Let's get back out there and let's be safe together. Like I said, it's an impromptu timeout. Scheduling it for saying, hey, I saw this today. I'm going to address it, first thing tomorrow. It's always good to do it right then and there. It's like I said, I just gave you a couple examples of how I would do it. And it takes no longer than 2 to 3 minutes to say, hey guys and gals, gather in. I want to do a quick 2 to 3 minute coaching session on some of the things that I saw today. A lot of the pallets were stacked haphazardly outside. If somebody were to grab one of those, like the rest would tumble over on them and it's just unsafe. So let's make sure we keep it nice and orderly out there. Thanks so much. Back to work, guys. Remember, you're talking to your employees and not down to them. You're not, scolding them like a child. You're always talking directly to them like they're your peers. And that's one of the things that I say is important, is the empathetic supervisor that can go through and talk to them and give that 51% to help them identify their hazards and let them know that they really care about them. So, be positive and caring. Don't be negative. Don't blame. Last, don't complain. Be sincere. Don't fake it. And make sure you convey it's all about them and not you. It's all about their safety. Because at the end of the day, it's if Brad's in your organization and he's, putting his slings on two ends of the bundle, when two far ends to the close to the end bundle when he's lifting it up, and at the end of the day, it might slip off. And who's going to get hurt? Brad, who's chaining these potentially, or is it somebody else when it actually slips off the sling and falls down? Who's going to get hurt? And that's why you need to make sure it's relay. It's all about them, their safety. You care about them. You give 51%, and you don't want to see anybody get hurt. So I'd like to say let's try some role playing, but I think since it's a webinar, it might be a little bit challenging. So let's just kind of continue on with the hazard identification as one of the 5. So the hazard identification is the unsafe condition or act that can lead to an accident. Essentially, it falls in the accident zone where you have the unsafe act mixed with the hazard. Somebody's daydreaming while somebody's loading a truck to be delivered. The person daydreaming is on the opposite end of the trailer. The bundle falls off, rolls off, injures the employee. There's the accident zone. And here's a couple more examples. There's stuff in the walkway. The employee's daydreaming again. He's not paying attention. The accident happens when he falls and injures the knee. And we've seen a lot of these knee injuries where they're out of work and on workers' comp for a year plus, and it's just a headache and a nightmare for everybody. So remember, most unsafe conditions are a result of an unsafe act. So, what we like to do is have organizations go through and pick their top 10 hazards, and then they put that on a list, and then they post them throughout their warehouse. So whether that's getting on and off equipment, wearing their PPE, making sure the floor is clean, making sure that the trash is not overflowing. They have these 10 posted throughout their organization, laminated, and hopefully when we go through and do kind of an audit, we'll see, 3 out of the 10 have been completed. The floors are remarkably clean. The pallets are stacked nicely. Similar products are stacked together, not above stanchions and falling over. And you can go through and kind of monitor your behavior. And it's also good, since they see it out on the floor physically, it's also a great reminder for their hazards. So if you go through, you can do this, and you can also use this to do it if you did 10, or what we call the dirty dozen, you pick 12. You can actually do formal supervising coaches, and you can have one for every month of the year, pre-planned out based upon your organization. And where does this hazard list come from? It comes from your employees, because they're out on the floor and you ask them to kind of speak up, and I know sometimes it's hard. So what I've done is we've sent you a list of about 16 that we see as the greatest hazards in metal service centers to kind of get you started. Some might not be applicable to you and some might be, but it would help give you on a great start to figure out, you know, what are 10 hazards that you guys might want to focus on in the next year. So, let me see. Hold on, sorry, I'm a little bit thirsty. So, another tool is the visual observation. It's where you can, you know, you condition yourself as a supervisor and employee to detect the unsafe acts or conditions. That's like when we walk into an organization and we kind of hear zipping around really quick. Well, chances are that means these forklifts are just blowing through, you know, corners and going really fast. Like I said, one of the top things I hear a lot of is the sheer operating at a quick pace. You know, I'm an insurance guy, like by trade. I'm not a supervisor in a warehouse. But if I can pick it up that you're doing a quick pace production, your supervisor should be able to pick that up as well and realize, okay, let me go over there, make sure that those guards are in place and nobody's putting their fingers in there. Because all it takes is a quick split-second decision where somebody has an unsafe act with a lapse in judgment and they lose a digit. So you're really conditioning yourself with visual observations to really pick up on things. It's part of your daily activities as you move around the different departments, and it's kind of, you know, what you see when you're on the floor. So you can't really lead from an office. You know, there's a division, you know, with a wall. You actually have to be out on the floor, walking through, and making sure that everything's safe. And when you start to correct an individual's unsafe act, you use the same kind of communication process before. You know, hey, I've known that when you're changing the blades on the saws, you're not putting the guards back on. You know, A, that's an OSHA hazard, and B, you know, I don't want to see you get hurt. So just take the extra 30 seconds. It's more important for your safety than it is for the production for that 30 seconds that you save to put the saws back on. You know, Kelly, can I just get you to do that for me? Yes, perfect. Thanks so much. You know, I care about you. Stay safe. So it's a quick, 2 to 3 minute coaching session. You know, one of the things that we've done, and I know a lot of people are against it, is, and it's kind of a fine line, it's using technology in this day and age to your advantage. What that means is using, what I would say is, everybody has a cell phone. It's always within arm's reach, no matter if you're sleeping, you're sitting at your desk, you're walking around, it's always within your arm's reach. Use that camera to start taking pictures of unsafe acts. You know, they're great to take the attention off of the supervisor if he's uncomfortable speaking in person, and it can be directed to the phone or a printed out picture to use as a coaching session. And when you take the photo, if you can ask the employee, hey, can I take a photo of you? If they say, no, I don't feel safe, have somebody later reenact it for you to grab a photo. But make sure to take pictures of safe and unsafe acts, because the last thing employees want you to do is harp on them about all the unsafe things you see and not about the good stuff you see. So here's a quick picture that we do. We take photos out of all the organizations that we walk through. So we'd use this, and we've actually used this to develop what we call as a hazard hunt. And we go through and we'd say, what do you see wrong in this photo? And people could start chiming things out. And the next one, if we use it like in our photo hunts that we do, or it's on the floor, you can say, essentially, I see this material, unlike product is stacked together. It probably should be elsewhere in this channel. It's stacked above, the stanchion, so it could topple over if somebody's setting a chain on the other side. And then at the top, you see, a cut band, which could cut the individual. I don't want to see anybody get hurt, guys. Let's make sure we stack below the stanchions, and you could use this as a training piece. You do the same thing when you see great behavior. You say, hey, guys, you see anything wrong with this picture? Sometimes they'll be a little bit stumped, and you say, you shouldn't, because nothing is wrong. The gate's closed, you have great housekeeping, the PPE is being worn, you guys are doing a great job out there. Just want to let you know that I really notice all this. You guys are doing terrific. Thanks so much. I care about you. I just don't want to see anybody get hurt. The third tool is self-inspection. What this can do is a supervisor to uncover the unsafe acts and conditions out there. how do you do it effectively? You do during the shift so the employees can see you walking around with a clipboard. A lot of people have said, well, self-inspections with my checklist, it takes forever to walk through my whole organization. And I understand it takes time. You got things to do. But if you had it broken up and you walk through each one kind of quarterly throughout the week and you say, okay, I'm going to do this area today, I'm going to do this area tomorrow and this, and you make it just part of your routine, because chances are you're going to be walking through that area anyhow. It'll be great for you to kind of be able to keep track of, how you guys are doing. And then you can walk up to the employees as well and say, hey, how do things work? And they say, well, I've noticed, Kelly, you brought it to my attention, things were looking a little bit disorderly. There's a lot of, coils and cords on the ground, and it was a tripping hazard, so I make sure to, put them back on the reels where they belong. I don't want to see anybody get hurt, just like you say, okay, that's great. What self-inspection isn't, it's not you tattling on the individual, and make sure you just convey this to the individual. It shouldn't be done under the cover of darkness. This is walking around openly, and they know that you're going to go through and kind of audit, what's going on the floor. Because as a supervisor, you're ultimately in charge and should be in control of everything that happens. Again, don't forget the positives. Say, hey, Cheryl, I walked through your department the other day. I've noticed you're really clean over there. You've been doing a terrific job. I just want to say thank you so much. So make sure you compliment this. And if you do see hazards, share this with your other shifts as well. It's important to know if you have an accident or near miss, is how do you convey these to the other shifts or other branches that you might have. So make sure that you have some sort of conduit to transmit this information. The next tool to use is accident investigation. So this is the process where you drill down and get the real cause of an accident. You figure out, who was involved, what happened, and you do it as soon as the accident happens so it's fresh in everybody's mind. I would imagine part of your injury illness prevention or part of your behavior-based management system, you have kind of an accident investigation process already in place. If you do not, and you have any questions and want a template, I'm more than happy to email you over the template that we give to all of our clients to use as well. So with the accident investigation, do why everything's fresh in mind. And then once you're done with that, you complete this accident analysis. You can use this to review at your quarterly safety meetings, annually, but essentially, and this is one of the attachments that Carly's going to be sending out to you guys, our supervisor loves it. Essentially, in short, it gives you whom the employee is, and, which branch do they work at, when was the date of loss, what type of loss was it? Was it a medical only or an indemnity loss? The status is, is it an open or closed claim? What department was it in? What shift was it in? Who was their supervisor? How long have they been on the job? What's their performance, 1s, 2s, or 3s? Are they a repeat offender, meaning if they've had multiple accidents? What was the accident action? Was there progressive discipline? And, give the description of what happened. And what this tool does is that it'll be emailed out to you again, is it allows you in a snapshot to say, okay, Kelly Parker, we've said before he's a 3 performance, he's had a couple actions before, and real quickly you can audit his performance and say, you know what, I don't think Kelly Parker belongs in this organization anymore. He's a repeat offender. You guys have said before, he's not really a team player. Let's cut him out, cut out the cancer, get him out of here as quick as possible. And we're big advocates of that, because the fact is that Kelly Parker, if he's a 3 performer, he's a repeat offender with multiple injuries, he's either going to seriously injure himself or he's going to seriously injure somebody else. So I'm a firm, big believer of getting Kelly Parker out of that organization, or whomever your 3 repeat offender is, and it's, it's an ad hoc basis of what needs to be done with that individual. And then lastly is the action request form. And what is the action request form? This is if somebody's out there and somebody on your floor, your employees, and you really need to empower them for this, is to let them know to come to you as a supervisor or whomever might be the leader about an unsafe act that they've uncovered or condition. If they realize the slings are starting to get torn, that's something you need to point out. If they see that, the junction box is open and there's holes, and technically that's an OSHA violation that they need to be plugged up, you need to have these employees bring them out. Or the fact that it's like, hey, whenever I walk through Kelly's area, there's a lot of uncoiled cords. I'm usually carrying things. I don't want to trip and fall. Can we make sure that we, do something to get out there? It's a written request to kind of go through. And again, if this is something that you don't have, this is something that we can more than happy provide to you. You really need to go through and make sure you promote it within your organization, though, because people proactively, I see a lot of these action request forms, and the boxes are usually covered up and inaccessible. Make sure that your employees know that, you're always available and that you're going to do whatever you can to work on it. And chances are, you're going to get a lot of good suggestions, and sometimes you're not going to get some so good suggestions. So but always be receptive to it and say, okay, Gretchen, I understand that, you'd really like to see this done better. Let me see what we can do about it. And if you don't take action on them, let them know that it was a great suggestion, but currently you're going to be focusing on other things. Because the last thing you want to do is put down their suggestion and then they won't come back to you ever again with something. So make sure with the action request that you really, really champion people in your organization to take ownership. Because safety, it's with the individual first. To get them to come forward with the action requests. And you can use those again for your 2 to 3 minute coaching sessions. So I know we're kind of running out of time, so to bring kind of everything to conclusion, it's the supervisors, the managers, and the owners who have the real impact, because they're the ones that should be giving 51% to their employees. They're the ones that need to have the real impact on the floor. They need to be able to communicate, train, to coach, to motivate their individuals to do things safely. They need to be able to assimilate them into their process. They need to make sure that the threes don't cut them down. And if threes are cutting into them and bringing other people on the fringe and ruining things, you need to get rid of those three. As a supervisor, this is your most pivotal, because 9 out of 10 accidents happen, because of unsafe actions. And as we know, steel is very forgiving, or copper or brass or whatever. It's heavy. There's very small, few little accidents. You'll set down a bundle on your finger. That's probably the littlest accident we see. But as you guys know, far better than probably I do, there's a lot of hazards out in your work area, and it's a repetitive job. And that's why 90% of these accidents, happen, because people start daydreaming and they're dealing with heavy pieces of metal and heavy machinery. And so as a supervisor, you just really need to be aware to empower your employees to be the best employees that they can within your organizations, and to always give the 51%. And lastly, for these tools, the hazard ID, the visual observation, the self-inspection, the accident investigation, and the action request, these aren't tasks. These are tools for you to use every day within your organization. I know these slides will be coming over to you, that Carly will be forwarding you guys, so feel free to use these to role play within your organization. You'll also get the top 16 hazards. But I just really want everybody to be aware that safety is much more than just a sign on a wall that says we take safety first. It's reflective on your experience mod, the contracts you get, how your employees feel, how their family feels about the employees going to work every day. So use these tools to really drill down and be the best that you can do. Far too many companies play the short game of today and tomorrow, and it's the ones that play the long game that succeed for generations, the one that takes safety seriously and really communicate it and drive it home every day through 2 to 3 minute coaching sessions, what we believe. And I think I got about 5 minutes left, so I'll turn it back over to Carly if there's any questions out there.
Thank you, Kelly. Yes, please, if you have any questions for Kelly, go ahead and submit those now. Kelly, what are your thoughts on an employee incentive program to kind of help boost the, keeping people safe and, having those action requests come to the supervisor and that sort of thing?
As far as, monetary incentives and things like that, I'm not a firm believer in they work. I believe more in like a team cooperation, like a pizza party that rewards everybody rather than individually, because far too often these incentive programs will have one person picked out of a lotto or a raffle and reward that one individual. Meanwhile, the other 8, 10, 12 are fallen by the wayside, and although they did good things, their name just wasn't called this month. And I think employee incentives are good if it's a team building exercise, but if it's individual rewarding, I just don't think that it's the most effective mean. What I do think is effective, and Chicago Tube and Iron actually just had a great article about this. Their safety supervisor is amnesty for all near misses that need to be reported. And I think that's the most important, is having your employees know that if they report near misses, nobody's going to get in trouble, and the fact that, it's keeping them safe and everybody else safe. I think that's the ultimate incentive.
And are there any tips or, for, you mentioned that daydreaming, doing the same thing repetitively every single day, are there ways that organizations can, kind of alleviate some of the daydreaming or some of that repetitive nature? I know they get their scheduled breaks and that sort of thing, but, anything that maybe the company can do to kind of help, break up that mindset or that numbness. Yeah, the monotony.
It's challenging every organization. I was out at a client site that manufactures metal washers, and out on the floor it's about 100 decibels, and as you can imagine, they're just punch pressing for 8 hours a day, and so there's very little interaction between the people. And so we were trying to figure out in loud environments how to do it, but ultimately I think what it comes down to is the supervisor and all the employees realizing and recognizing that they all work as a team. So if they see Kelly operating a press and he's daydreaming and not paying attention, well, go over to Kelly and say, hey, guy, make sure you're paying attention to what you're doing. I don't want to see you lose a finger, an arm, a leg, whatever it might be. These are serious pieces of machinery, and I really care about you. So I think it's all back to these quick 2 to 3 minute coaching sessions where you address things like daydreaming, where you address things, like unsafe behaviors, acts. But it all goes down to, if you use the quick 2 to 3 minute coaching sessions, you don't have to have these long formal out presentation where you go watch a video in a room and then you go back in and back to work. These 2 to 3 minute coaching sessions will kind of keep everything fresh in people's minds, what we've seen over the years.
Got it. Going back to the hiring portion, kind of back at the beginning of the presentation, how does the supervisor know if the employee is actually qualified, or, kind of the fit for duty exams? Can you send the employees to do that test prior to?
Yes, you can. And so we have a lot of them. So a lot of, I can imagine employers out there have, a drug and alcohol screening beforehand before they get employed with the individual. Well, those clinics, those Concertas, UF Health Work, or whomever you use, are able to do the same fit for tests. And so what we'll actually do as our brokers, we'll go out and interview the clinic as well, and we'll send over job descriptions of what these people need to do. And they'll go through and they'll make sure that these people can, twist, bend, lift, do whatever these people need to do on a daily basis. And that's why it's good to always have an updated document where the supervisor, knows, if I'm going to hire, Kelly tomorrow, this is what his jobs need to be. These are accurate jobs. Let's give this to our clinic, because then you can use that for not only the pre-employment physical fit for duty test, but when somebody gets injured and they have to have a return to work program, well, this, physician that they're going to also knows, these are what their job specifications are if they have to come to work for, light duty or return to work. So it's always great to have that job posting and job description and duties and scope of responsibility always updated, and give it to the pre-employment fit for duty test, and then also for post-accident.